In the gospel accounts, are you puzzled when Jesus tells someone not to do something and in the very next sentence, they do what Jesus told them not to do? Well, if you're puzzled by that, I'm right there with you. And if you'll stick around for this podcast, we'll take a look at what's up with all of that. I'm David Miller. I'm the pastor of membership and missions here at McGregor Baptist Church, and this is Beyond the Notes. This past Lord's Day, we continued our study of the book of Matthew, and we dealt with several more miracles that Jesus performed. And in one of those miracles, Jesus healed two blind men and restored their sight in Matthew chapter 9, verses 27 through 31. And as I said on Sunday, the result of that miracle is described in the last two verses there by something that made me smile when I read it. Verse 30 says, "And their eyes were opened, and Jesus sternly warned them, 'See that no one knows about it.'" Then in verse 31, it says, "But they went away and spread his fame through all that district." I mentioned on Sunday that verse 31 makes me smile because Jesus tells them to keep it under wraps and they go tell everybody. But this is not an isolated incident, though. It happens at several other miraculous moments by Jesus. For example, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus heals a man with leprosy in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. And after he cleansed the leper, Jesus says this in verse 44. He says, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest." And the man disobeys that instruction of Jesus, and he told anybody who would listen about his healing, so much so that verse 45 says that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places. The guy disobeyed Jesus by spreading the news about his healing. And then the Luke 5 version of Jesus healing that man with leprosy is even more descriptive. And in Luke 5:15, it states there that the result was the report about him, meaning Jesus, went abroad, and great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities. So the crowds got bigger, and while most pastors today would see that as a wonderful thing, Jesus was never impressed with crowds. Another example of this is in Mark 7, verses 31 through 37, as Jesus heals a deaf and mute man. And he does so by taking him away from the crowd, and he heals him privately. But then, as verse 36 says, Jesus charged them to tell no one, but the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. Sounds like a room full of 4-year-olds, doesn't it? The more you tell them not to do something, the more defiant they are in doing it. And I'll give you one more example of this, and it has to do with the healing of Jairus' daughter. In the Matthew 9 passage that we looked at on Sunday, there is no mention of Jesus telling the little girl or Jairus, her dad, not to tell anybody, but the Luke 8 version of that same miracle mentions in Luke 8:56 that Jesus said, and I quote, "Charge them to tell no one what happened." And that's the last verse in Luke 8 about that particular miracle. So hang with me for a second, because if you go back to Matthew 9 and you look at the last verse that mentions this healing of Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9:26, it clearly says, "And the report of this went through all that district." So when you synchronize the Matthew 9 version of Jairus' daughter being healed with the Luke 8 version of Jairus' daughter being healed, you once again have Jesus prohibiting the mention of this miracle and the news spreading around. So somebody spilled the beans about Jairus' daughter. So these are just some of the examples that I found where Jesus says, don't tell anyone, and then the person or persons disobeyed him and they told other people. And in your own study of the Word of God, if you find others that you might have missed, then just let me know about that. I'd love to hear about that. I often say, don't take my word for it, but read the Bible for yourself. Now, I did find several times where Jesus said, do not tell anyone, and the person did not run off and tell other people after they got healed. And in those instances, unless there's a parallel account maybe of the same miracle in the other Gospels that I may have missed, I think it is safe to assume there that those folks obeyed Jesus when he said, don't tell anybody about your healing. But when he does prohibit the sharing of a miracle, the question is, why does Jesus do that? Why does he make this prohibition when he makes it? Well, we can speculate all we want, but the safest play is always to go back to the text. Again, Matthew 9:31 that we looked at this past Sunday plainly states, but they went away and spread his fame through all that district. The answer's right there. It's fame. Fame was the last thing that Jesus wanted. He didn't come to be famous. See, the more publicity Jesus got over these miracles, the more attention he received. And Jesus tells the two former blind men, see that no one knows about it, because he doesn't want to divert away from his message. He was training his disciples to understand his role as Messiah. Richard T. France, in his commentary on Matthew, puts it in a way that I just love. He says this, he says, there is an inevitable tension between Jesus' desire to avoid inappropriate publicity and the powerful testimony which his miracles offered of who he was. I think that is spot on. Jesus performed miracles, but that was not his main purpose. In his own words, he came to seek and save the lost. That's what he said in Luke 19, verse 10. You know, sin has consequences. That's why we need Jesus. And I bet if you think about your yesterday and the day before that and the day before that, you and I could come up with a list of victories in Jesus that we experience, and probably a longer list of moments of disobedience to Jesus. That's the Christian life. That's the experience of following Christ. See, the blind men from Matthew chapter 9 were no different than us. Same with the leper from Mark chapter 1. He disobeyed Jesus when he told everyone after he was healed, and it actually had an impact on where Jesus conducted his ministry. Jesus had to move his ministry away from the heart of the city into desolate places. That's the exact phrase from Mark 1:45 as the ESV records it. And yeah, that it's a bit confusing and kind of funny that some of these people whom Jesus healed, even though they had great faith, they didn't obey his instruction to keep quiet. But how could they? They would never be the same again. Jesus had overcome something big in their life so that they would understand he actually came to overcome something even bigger in their life. And that's sin. Christ came for sinners like you and me. And it's only in him that we can be forgiven of our sin and be saved from our sin. That's why he came. He came to set us free immediately from the penalty of sin and to set us free progressively from the power of sin. And ultimately, one day when we go to be with him, he'll set us free from the presence of sin. It's why he came. Thank you for listening today. And if you've been encouraged by this, hit the like button or comment or share this podcast with somebody that you know that may need it or be encouraged by it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do that. And before we go, if you want to be ready for next Sunday's sermon, we will pick up right where we left off, beginning in Matthew chapter 9, and we'll cover verses 35 in Matthew 9 through chapter 10, verse 4. So if you want to read ahead, now you know. Have a great week.